It's very nice to welcome you back, and my name's Shahid Khan, and I'd like to thank EVIMalaR for giving me the opportunity to introduce our next speakers. So, those of you who were at the morning session will realise it was actually a really dynamic, a really interesting talk about different issues affecting African scientists. And we'd like to carry on now with maybe more on the agency side. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce Lynn Marie from EVIMalaR, who'll be talking about the agenda for African science as far as EVIMalaR is concerned.
Okay, thanks, and a good afternoon to you all. Francis asked me to talk to you about EVIMalaR and from an African scientist perspective. So I'm a member of EVIMalaR, but I also work at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So I'll be able to provide you a little bit of my view of what EVIMalar's objectives are and what they're trying to achieve, but then also put that into perspective of what we talked about this morning in terms of the debate points, and how I think we can learn from EVIMalar's model and how we can approach that in a different way and put that in an African context. So EVIMalaR is a joint FP7 network of excellence. It's a virtual institute of scientists that are currently funded by the European Commission. We currently have 56 full partners containing about 37 institutes, and these are spread throughout Europe. We have partners in Africa, India, and Australia. These include affiliated members, so we not only have full partners, we also have affiliated members, about 28 of those. And we have a PhD program as well as postdoctoral fellows that are shared within the EVIMalaR context. The EVIMalaR objective really is to integrate malaria research. And the focus here is to understand the basic knowledge of the parasite, the vector, as well as the biology of the interactions of the parasite with both its human host as well as the vector itself. So the research interest that the partners within the broader EVIMalaR network is focused on is really the biology and the pathology of malaria in context of immunobiology, pathophysiology, parasite molecular cell biology, vector-parasite interactions, as well as modeling and systems biology. So it's really a comprehensive network of excellence encompassing various factors of malaria research. Now, what EVIMalaR is really good at is bringing experts together in a network of malaria research. So they provide an effective mechanism for shaping and progressing the European research agenda, and in that context they are integrating scientists from disease endemic research regions. That is why they have partners from African institutions as well. They interface also with other basic research networks. But in the whole context, EVIMalaR is really the biggest basic malaria research network in the world currently. Not only do they do, and the members of EVIMalaR, we're not busy with basic research for the sake of basic research, however, we are really aligned to feed the therapeutic pipeline. So we're doing things that should, in the end, mean something for malaria control and eradication. So if we now look at EVIMalaR and the influence that EVIMalaR as a model system can have in terms of African science and African malaria research, I think EVIMalaR really can lead by example and is leading by example, and we as African scientists should take that example forward and do something about this. They do provide a model system for research excellence. We can replicate that model system in Africa in an African context. They do provide what is really important, a shared expertise. The network is there of members, made up of members that is able to share the expertise. They also share technology platforms, and they provide access to resources. And those are things that we as African scientists can tap into, both in a European community, but also we should strengthen our own African community in that manner. EVIMalaR is really good also at developing and promoting the development of African science. So one of the key focus areas within EVIMalaR at the moment is to incorporate more African scientists as partners as well as members, affiliates within the network itself. And this will provide access then to expertise and technology transfer that is really needed in the African context. They do support funding opportunities for African developmental programs, and they would like to see the establishment of a research excellence environment in Africa, including a knowledge-based research development program. So, given that context of what EVIMalaR is trying to achieve in a broader sense, how do we apply that to what we talked about this morning in terms of the African malaria research context? And what I'd like to do is to give you a response from EVIMalaR in terms of all of these discussion points that we talked about this morning. So we firstly talked about, do African researchers have to stay in Africa? or should they move to Western countries and rather do research there, basic biology type research? And the answer there is from the EVIMalaR side is really no. They can come to or go to Western countries, but EVIMALAR's mandate there is to host and to train and to collaborate to strengthen the expertise in the African context. And that can be really easily done through exchange visits. So the EVIMALAR network is open to these type of endeavours. They will allow collaboratively shared platform networks as well as resources. They foster the future generations of research through research fellowships. They're also very supportive on both financial and intellectual levels. And the question really is, EVIMALAR also has a partnership with what's called EVIMALAR in Australia, where there's a network of researchers in Australia focused on malaria research that then interacts very, very closely with EVIMALAR. Should we as African scientists not set up a network like that, that we can tap into these expertise networks like EVIMALAR? In terms of Western versus African funding sources for malaria research, I don't think there's a single answer to this. Money is scarce. You're probably going to get it where you want it. So EVIMALAR funds network activities, and that's what's really good about the model of EVIMALAR. It is not a major funding source for big research projects. However, it provides funding for shared expertise, technology transfer, and so forth. Both African and Western resources should be collaboratively used, and they do create joint integrated research programs, and that's what their strength is all about. Can we develop African research institutions as centres of excellence? Answer is yes, we can, and yes, we should. EVIMALAR will provide and can provide access to world-leading capacity, resources, technology platforms, infrastructure, and expertise training. The network model supports both centres as well as individuals, and that is the beauty of a virtual network. It is a virtual institute, so people at different institutions and as well as at centres of excellence are able to be incorporated into EVIMALAR itself. A network strengthens individuals as well as centres, and strength really lies in numbers, and that's what EVIMALAR is so good at. It incorporates all those researchers, 56 members, providing more than 500 publications in a context of 3 years. African exclusivity to research on endemic topics. The EVIMALAR view on this is that they support knowledge interchange, and knowledge should be developed without borders, and research should be developed without borders. Therefore, if we as African scientists are going to sit on our indigenous knowledge and not share that and not enable other people to help us, that'll be short-sighted. EVIMALAR is also very instrumental in outreach and educational progress and projects, and that is where, again, we can tap into that model as African scientists and use that model in order to get our message out there. So really, if we're going to look at the European Malaria Research Network as an example, African research, malaria research, is sometimes application-driven, not always, but mostly application-driven, and that is because we have to do research that is grant authority prescriptive and that is governmental priority selective. We cannot break out of that. We can try and adapt and change towards that situation. We are working in an environment where money is prioritised for different public health reasons. And therefore, as a research network, EVIMALAR can try and help us to prioritise that toward basic research creation or knowledge creation as well. So really my opinion in terms of the way forward and learning lessons from EVIMALAR as African scientists is that in our context and on this continent, we need to realise that malaria should not be a way of life. We should not just cope with the crisis every day. And in this context, that's where we need to talk to governing bodies and funding agencies, because we cannot just control and spend our money on control. They should, and we should, inform them to fund researchers to allow us to understand what we are fighting. We need to understand malaria as a disease and a complex disease that it is. And researchers should be provided the freedom in order to do that, because if we don't know what we're fighting in the dark. So we should know our enemy, and then the cliche would be that hopefully we're going to get to African solutions to African problems. Thank you.
Next up we have Kate Whitfield, I believe. yes, who's going to give us a few words about MESA, and I think she can introduce the acronym.
So MESA, the Malaria Eradication Scientific Alliance, follows in the footsteps of Malaria. And you may very well know Malaria, may have been involved in Malaria. This was a consultative process involving more than 250 experts in the field, and over a period of 2 years developed a research agenda to underpin the malaria eradication efforts. So MESA is very much about taking the follow-up actions and the following steps based on malaria. We identify 4 key functions for MESA. So an ideas incubator, knowledge management processes, catalyzing research, and monitoring progress. So I'll take you through what we mean by those 4. So in terms of ideas incubator, this is a play on words of the name MESA. MESA in Spanish means table. So the ideas incubator function is about providing a platform, a meeting space for discussion, exchange of ideas between researchers, endemic country professionals, and so on. And a couple of examples of activities related to the ideas incubator. Firstly, what we're doing here at MIM. So you may notice in your very thick programs that we're sponsoring 2 symposia. So one in collaboration with MESEPA, which is on the Monday, and another on the Wednesday. So the MESA Symposia is really about sharing lessons learned from an African perspective. And the symposia on the Wednesday is about sharing lessons learned outside Africa. So we have a speaker from Latin America, China, the Eastern Mediterranean region, and so on. Always with the focus of operational research. Then another key activity coming up next year, you may have seen from the exhibition outside, is the Keystone Symposia in collaboration with MESA. This is a very high-level scientific program where we cover topics from parasite-host interaction through to health systems, through to mathematical modeling, again, very much inspired by the Malaria agenda. Okay, so that was ideas incubator. Then knowledge management. This is a little bit of a jargon, which maybe means different things to different people. So for MESA, knowledge management means examining the existing evidence. So evidence that's published or also evidence in the grey literature. And here, our partnership with WHO, the GMP, the Global Malaria Programme, is really crucial. So as I said, Mar is our colleague based with the team at GMP, and her work, examples of her work are right now include participation in the development of the global VIVAC strategy, and systematic review, landscaping, and identifying gaps within operational research with a focus on malaria elimination. Then the function of catalyzing research. So this is when people's ears prick up, because this is when we start to talk about money. So MESA has some funds to support critical research. And last year, 2012 was our first year, we set up a process which involved identifying gaps, open a competitive call for proposals, and through an independent peer review process, identified and funded 6 research projects, 3 in the theme of measuring transmission and 3 in the theme of health systems readiness. Both the process that we followed and the winning applicants are available outside. They're also available on the web. In terms of catalyzing research, this will be something that we will do again this year. So we're in the stages of finalizing and defining our next call for proposals. And at the end of this year, you can expect that we will launch our next call for proposals with a focus which I hope is interesting for this audience on operational research and focusing on health systems. We will make sure to widely disseminate that information. We always use the website Malaria World, which some of you may sign up to, and we'll certainly work with Francis to make sure that you all get that email. Okay, and finally, so the fourth function is monitoring progress. So understanding and tracking what research is being picked up within the malaria agenda, where the money is going, and perhaps what's being left behind. And again, towards the end of this year, you can expect one of the first outputs of this kind of work. So we've worked in collaboration with a group called Policy Cures to really understand what's been invested where in 2011. So you can expect a report at the end of the year to see where vaccines, drugs, operational research, and so on, who is funding what. So as I said, we are based in Barcelona at the IS Global, the Institute for Global Health in Barcelona. That's the secretariat. We have our key partner here at the Global Malaria Programme in WHO. And through our governing bodies, we really reach every corner of the world, from New Delhi to Bangkok to Melbourne to Basel.
Now I'd like to invite Jane Kionda from the Wellcome Trust, who's going to be giving some information, I believe, to the Wellcome Trust actions for African scientists.
So the vision of the Wellcome Trust, and many of you perhaps have seen this before, is to support outstanding researchers. And this support is through the different stages of their careers, starting from very earlier on to up to research leaders. So we cut across the whole lifeline, as you would say, for the support of researchers. But I want to emphasize that it's about outstanding researchers. So there is a tendency to go for merit. And I know that this morning some of you are arguing with me about equity. But if there is a choice to be made between equity and merit, the trust will go strongly for merit. And there is an effort to try and accelerate the application of research. We believe that research should make a difference on the ground, and maybe it's within this context that we support outfits like MMV to make products, to make drugs, which can make a difference on the ground. And we have also a human component, which is looking at at putting research, putting science, putting medicine in the context of cultural settings and people's lives. And perhaps this is not always well known, that we have this type of grants which can deal with social scientists, with people in communication, and with people in humanities. This is usually not well known. But also, I think sometimes right at the front of the vision is this human and animal health. And I think the animal element is usually also not recognized. It's not just human health that we deal with. We also have a component of animal health. And the will of Sir Henry Wellcome sets the major vision, because it specifically says that he wanted to have benefits for the global community. So many people usually think, oh, is it just the English or the British or the institutions which are funded? It's very well spelled out in his will that it's the global community. So we've supported over 3,000 researchers in more than 50 countries. And at the moment, the total spend is about £750 million a year. And I'm happy to say that over 100 million of this goes for international activities. And I will say a little bit more about what these activities are about. In terms of global health research, we want to focus on under-resourced environments, and that's where Africa comes in, but also to make sure that this research we support has potential for having health benefits. So our global health research is actually not very discovery-oriented, but more towards achieving health impacts. and also to support capacity building, networking, partnerships, but again, focusing on the real problems of real people. We have, this diagram usually guides our thinking. We have a focus on people, and that's, I will soon discuss the fellowships we have. We have a focus on teams and programs, and I'll give some examples of that. But we also have these major overseas programs where we have investments in large amounts for a sustained period. And we also do networking and partnerships. And I'll give you just a few examples right away. So we have one scheme, which is the Public Health and Tropical Medicine Fellowship Scheme. It's specific for low and middle income countries. And maybe this is where, and as it's not disease specific, malaria researchers can apply to this one as well. It offers training for masters, for research training, but it goes even further and can support intermediate researchers, senior researchers, and principal researchers. So it is this breadth of spread that allows us to be able to capture from a wide audience. And particularly since this one is focused on low and middle income countries, it should be very attractive for people working in malaria. The aim is to stimulate and foster research in public health and tropical medicine. The major overseas programs are perhaps some of the ones you are more familiar with, and I know that some of you work in these programs. And these ones actually take a large part of the trust's funding. We commit around 130 million pounds a year to these programs. You are very familiar with Kevin Marsh and his team in Kemri, and thanks to Francis for arranging this. We also have a big center in Malawi, in Blantyre. We have another center in KwaZulu-Natal, here in South Africa. And we have 2 or so centers in outside Africa. We have a big center in Thailand, and we have a big center in Vietnam as well. And I have put on the slide the leaders of these centers. And people like Nick White are very well known in malaria, and of course Kevin Marsh as well. The major programs are a good example of how we build research environments to make them world-class. For example, on this photo, and I'm sure I could have got a better photo, but it shows how Kilifi, Kemri Wellcome Trust Kilifi, moved from what was just like a small building with a shed outside and 2 logos, banner in front of it, to a world-class research center. So we use these major overseas programs to enrich these research environments. We have several strategic awards, and a strategic award is a large award given to an individual or a team or an institution, but which has actually shown that they have a strategic direction and they can move things. They are not doing business as usual stuff. And we have 4 of them, and I already mentioned Brian's, which is focused on building capacity for malaria. But we have one in Uganda, which is on infection and immunology research, and this can also include malaria. We have one in Cape Town, which is focusing on clinical research. And the group in Kilifi also has a capacity building component, which is supported through a strategic award. This is one of our biggest investments in terms of building capacity in Africa. It's called the African Institutions Initiative. These are 7 awards made to what we call 7 consortia, and each of these consortium can include up 5, 6, or even 7 institutions, all working together with a common goal and a common objective. And so far, 70 African institutions have been able to benefit through this large initiative. It's the first 5 years coming to a close, but we are already negotiating for renewals. We haven't yet decided whether this is going to expand or we are going to remain with these institutions we are already supporting, but I think there's a very big chance that it could open out, or at least some of the institutions might move out and others could move in, and some of these could be malaria research institutions. We have 2 big initiatives which specifically focus on health research capacity for individual countries, but can also include some countries in the region. We have one in Kenya, which is based in an NGO that perhaps some of the Kenyans who are here will be familiar with, the Consortium for National Health Research, and one in Malawi, which is embedded within the National Council of Science and Technology. These are efforts to try and focus country-level investments to train people in research that is relevant to those countries, and it covers a whole range of training from short courses to masters to PhDs and postdocs, so it's a variety of investments. It's also coming close to its 5-year cycle completion, but again, we are already in discussion with them to see what the next steps could be. It's co-funded with DFID, and IDRC was also initially engaged in its funding. DFID is still very keen on moving forward with us. We have a scheme on biomedical ethics. This again is targeted to low and middle income countries. This is again one of the less well-known ones. It can provide research studentships, research travel grants. It can support symposia and project grants. And sometimes these are not necessarily advertised in a major way, but I think if you have something that you can write up, a short concept note and send to one of us at the trust, we would see how best to fit it within the scheme. These are the efforts I talked to you about, international engagement awards. They can go up to £30,000. They can be embedded within your already existing Wellcome Trust's funding to understand how to engage the local community, the policymakers, how these networks strengthen the link between science and the human aspects of life. And sometimes we call them that we want to listen to other voices rather than scientists talking to scientists. And these ones, in fact, we recently had a call and we got a very, very good response. And we are now thinking that maybe this is something that we can do kind of regularly. We have very, very recent, and some of them are not yet out. We recently put out a call on research for health in humanitarian crisis, and I know that malaria gets worse during humanitarian crises. This is a scheme that is funded between the Wellcome Trust and DFID, and we got very, very good response, and we are at the moment skimming through them to see who can get the first tranche of funding. And very soon there will be a call on research to improve health systems. This is something we are working on with the British Medical Research Council. And again, this is something that malaria in African settings should actually find a space in this type of scheme. So finally, my final slide, it would, I think, be unfair not to announce the recent appointment of our new director, Jeremy Farrell. He took his job this week on the 1st of October. But in his opening speech, he made a statement which many of us liked, acknowledging that the trust is a national asset, but very extraordinary. And then the good track record in in science, innovation, public engagement, and medical humanities. And of course, he appreciates very well the stewardship that has taken place for this endowment to make sure that it grows and expands and can continue to benefit humanity. He spent 18 years in the center in Vietnam, so he understands very well international health, and we are all really excited and looking forward to perhaps an expansion of global health and expansion of international health. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should have said maybe after all the other talks, but if people were any questions, maybe they could approach the speakers directly, maybe just after this meeting. So now it's my real pleasure to introduce someone that probably doesn't need much introducing, Brian Greenwood, who will be giving a presentation not only on these efforts I think they're currently engaged in, but maybe some reflections, recollections, and suggestions.
So I'm taking in my talk a slightly different tack. I'm going to be talking particularly about developing very, very strong leadership among African scientists. And we're focusing here on malaria, but it's what the conference is about. But hopefully some of the things we're talking about have a broader relationship. Malaria is not just one thing, one particular disease, and some of the lessons we've learned may be relevant to other things. Now, so we're thinking about developing the leaders, the people who are really going to lead the research on malaria in Africa, and this is a long process. And I think it starts at school, and I think Kalifi is a good example of where they have actually involved school children, getting people interested in science, moving on through the undergraduates with your perhaps periods of secondment to a laboratory, going on then to your PhD students, your postdoctoral fellows, your research group leader, and your head of an institution or somebody who's really leading in it, perhaps one of these sort of networks that we're talking about. And that probably takes about 20 years if things are going really well. And I think we could discuss some of these things about the earlier stages, but I think what we're really focused on is thinking a little bit more about how we develop, identify, develop, and then support the postdocs and the leaders. And we discussed this morning some of the challenges that people face who are deciding to follow that career in Africa. And this was my list. I wrote this before we had the talk. I didn't change it. We'll come back to this at the end of the talk. But I think the sort of things I was thinking about are much what we discussed this morning. And I think we're all familiar with these. I mean, it's difficult in finding a position in an institution after you've perhaps done your PhD abroad, and then once you've done that, you don't have the resource, you don't have the money, and all the usual things that we're familiar with, and often there isn't a career pathway for people to follow. So it can be quite discouraging in making that step from having done your PhD somewhere and trying to establish your own group. And it doesn't get a lot better even when you're a senior researcher. And I think I'm sure we have some people here who've had that experience. You get drawn off into all sorts of administrative and political things, and it's difficult to keep up with the science. So what we've been trying to do in the last 15 years or so now is actually develop some systems to try to help to facilitate that process. And this is through the Gates Malaria Partnership, and then that moved on, as Jane has mentioned, into the Malaria Capacity Development Consortium. And I think it's very important to don't think this is all that is happening. This is just one example of many other groups, NIH group, we heard about the African universities and so on and things. And many people, I think, have been learning the same lessons as how one helps people and going through this process. And perhaps one thing that it isn't happening quite enough is the sharing of experience of the different groups. So I'm just going to focus on, this is obviously the thing I've had the personal experience of, and some of the lessons that we've learned going through this process during the years, and some have actually overlapped with what Jane was saying. So I sort of first got involved in this process through the Gates Malaria Partnership when I went back from working in Africa. Fairly soon afterwards, we were very fortunate to get a fairly large grant. It was a very large grant in those days from the Gates Foundation. They had to get rid of some money quickly. They looked around, who can we give some money to? And we were very lucky to do that. So we didn't have a lot of time to prepare this, like 6 weeks. And these were the things we tried to do. So what I'm going to talk to you about is the capacity development component of that program. And what we did, the same things, really the same things Jane was covering, helping to support the infrastructure, and then looking for the people, supporting the postdocs, the people who already made that commitment to science, and then finding the new people who are going to be the future research leaders. So for equipment, we discussed this morning, I mean, one can't do a lot if you don't have the equipment. The basic, you don't necessarily have to have the most high-tech mass spec or whatever, but without the basic laboratory structure, then it's not going to be possible to do certainly very good lab research. And for the field research, you need the vehicles and so on and things. So we did spend some of our money from the Gates Malaria Partners on supporting these 2 labs in one very beautiful venue, Kilimanjaro Christian Medical College. And that lab is absolutely thriving. It's doubled and trebled in size since that happened. The one in Tanga hasn't done so well, and so that is a risk. You can build sometimes if you go first for the structure rather than going for the person, you may have a problem with that. So it is quite high risk building the structure of that. And TDR made that mistake many years ago in Andola, choosing that, and they sort of built the center before they had the people to go and work there. So there has to be a balance between supporting the infrastructure and the people. For the PhD program, we thought obviously we were looking for the future leaders. We had a competitive program for doing that, and it was quite a generous program. So the PhD students got a decent stipend, the same as if they had a Wellcome Trust stipend in the UK. They had a supervisor from a northern partner, and they registered for their degree in one of the partners. Now, our partners were Liverpool School, London School, and the University of Copenhagen. They nearly all did their work in Africa, but they were sort of being monitored and followed through and had to keep up with all the sort of support training and things as the same as if they were in a northern university. And following on, the lead at TDR really was the first to do that, and having re-entry grants, there was an opportunity for them to apply for a grant for them to get back into their own university. As far as the postdocs were concerned, we tried to see what we could do to help them. So we tried to pick some of the really people in that difficult stage between perhaps a second postdoc and becoming the research leader, and seeing what we could do to help them. And we learned some lessons in that process. And they had mentoring and so on, and some financial support. So what came from that program? Did it actually work? Well, I think it did. We had the 6 postdocs stayed in Africa. They might not have done if they hadn't had that extra support from outside, and 3 of them are the sort of people we're looking for, of directing research institutes. All the 35 PhD students passed. I think there were 32 of them were for Africa. There were a few other ones there, and 30 of those 32 have gone back to Africa. And we sometimes hear the story that you train your PhDs in the northern countries, they won't go back. They will go back if they're supported for the reasons, again, we discussed this morning. People want to go back if they can do what they've learned to do that. And because this was a very competitive process, we got some very bright people. They were very, very productive, and there were 1 or 2 sitting in the audience here. This was a strong program. It did identify some of the African leaders, and even within a 10, 12-year period, we've seen them moving on. PhD students have done very well, and people have gone back to Africa. But it was quite an expensive process in keeping people there, both the PhD and the postdocs, of giving them a good project to do and supporting them. This is quite an expensive process. But if you really want the leaders, you're going to get, if you want somebody to do a good PhD project, you can't do that on $5,000, which is what quite a lot of African students have to do. And it was very focused on the individuals. We were looking for the individuals who were going to become research leaders. So I think the Gates Foundation were reasonably happy with what we'd done, but they decided that was not the sort of thing that they wanted to support, and we were very fortunate that Wellcome Trust came along and picked up the project, which then became Malaria Capacity Development Consortium. The Gates Foundation then had sort of second thoughts and gave us some more money as well to try to keep the thing going. And this has 3 components. It doesn't have an infrastructure component, but it does have some support for equipment and so on when people are writing their research grants. It has a new PhD program, which we have 20 PhD students. I think all of them here. I think they're all here at MIM. And the key thing was providing some support for the previous 32 PhD students that had gone through Africa. And then the new thing that we were really doing, we realized that we, in the previous program, it was very personal focused, and we were not really helping as much as we could the overall training for PhD and postgraduate students in the universities where we were working. So a key part of this new program has been to support 5 African universities where all the PhDs are now registered. So these are the differences from the PhD program. The students are now registered in the African university rather than in the northern one, and we've been doing the best we can to improve the overall training for PhD in those universities. And they have an advisory panel. They do have a co-supervisor from the Northern University, but much of the responsibility has gone to the African university with a bit of help. And for the PhD students, we introduced, I think, was a fairly sort of novel process. They had to apply to become what we call an MCDC investigator, and that they had certain commitments on their part in doing that. And if they did so, they wanted to do that to nearly most of the PhD students, but not all of them. Some didn't want to be involved. Then they got some continuing support. They got access to a mentorship program, a small grants program, and so on, and things that would help them in that transition in their first postdoctoral fellowship program. As far as the strengthening the university and strengthening the postgraduate training program is concerned, we were very fortunate to have the involvement of Imelda Bates, that some people will know from the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, who has sort of become the world expert in this area now. And she did, sounds common sense, what happens in many other areas, but we haven't often done in postgraduate training, did a baseline needs assessment of each of the universities to see what the blocks were that were making it difficult for the PhD students and for the postdocs to advance. And it was some of the obvious things, I mean, library access, internet access, and so on and things. But one, I think, the really interesting things that emerged from this process, that at least half, probably about 2/3 of the problems could be handled without extra funds or with very small amount of money. There were some, for example, if you didn't have broadband internet access that did need more money, but a lot could be done by just looking to see what were the problems with the postgraduate training. And subsequently, we've done follow-up to that, and many of those things have actually been put into place. And just a couple of examples, I mean, just having a desk and a computer for the postdocs to sit in, a room for them to sit in. And surprisingly, if you go around, some people, we were hearing this morning, you go back from your PhD, there's nowhere for you to sit or to work, nobody to do that. Just some simple things like that. And another thing that was done, I think some of you probably had experience yourselves here, that when you're doing PhD, there are no guidelines for many African universities as to what you do, how you register, what you do, and they, working together, the universities have actually never adopted that. And that, I think, is an example. We can see here, even in Makerere, that this was the case, which is perhaps one of the strongest universities in Africa. There was no sort of system to do that. And working across the universities, they've been able to strengthen some of those sort of supporting things to make life easier for the PhD students and the postdocs. One thing we initiated in the Gates Malaria Partnership, and Hazel McCulloch is sitting at the back there, if some of you want to talk about this or about the mentoring program, is something that's happened very widely in northern universities now, is what's called personal development planning, when the PhD student or the investigator gets some money of their own to decide how they're going to use that to help their career, a small amount of money, and they make a plan of what they might do. And that might be learning GIS system, or it might be learning French, or how to manage grants, or a distance learning masters or something. They make that decision, and Hazel will help them with that in making that plan, but it is up to them to do that. And I think that's been very successful. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and people have found that has helped them in that period when they're transitioning to becoming a senior scientist. And this is followed on the website. If anyone you're interested, some of the Hazel follows this up, what's happening, giving a bit of help, and they can all access into that. And then more recently, we introduced a formal mentoring program, and this is a fairly low-key one, but the students and the mentors, the mentees sign a contract between them, and they each know what they're going to what they're expected to do. And on the whole, that's working pretty well. And there have been some guidelines, and those are available on the MCDC website, or Hazel can help you with that. And I think it is surprising what just a little bit of mentoring, a little bit of contact to some people, they've got somebody to turn to if they have a problem, can really be helpful in people making that transition. So the next steps for MCDC, Jane mentioned that the trust is, that several of these programs are coming to an end, and MCDC has 2 more years to do. They're focusing a bit on the management training. That's one sort of thing we do, how you grant, how you become a leader, how you manage yourself, your staff, and so on. Things that's actually a workshop going on now for the PhD students when we're starting on that sort of process to do that. But then I think in 2 or 3 years' time, or probably next year, Jane, isn't it really, the trust will start thinking, perhaps bringing together the experience they've had from some of these programs to know how is the best way, what have we learnt in the last few years as to how to build these strong research groups. And if there is an MCDC3, we don't know whether that will happen or not. We have had discussions with our colleagues, and it was very interesting in light of what was said this morning, because what the general feeling was that what they felt next was building and I put it in a different color here because this morning we said we didn't want to call it a center, but they wanted to build in their university a strong group in malaria that would be linked to some of the outside networks and things. And they felt that was the next stage in the development. PhD programs, supporting the postdocs, and then building your center. So a couple of slides for those people who weren't here this morning. We had a very good, I think, productive discussion, what the challenges were, and these were some of the things that came up, which I think are much the same as what I thought in preparing my talk. I don't think there's anything unusual about that. But what was good, I think, this morning, there were some really very concrete discussions and suggestions of what could be done to meeting those challenges, because often those discussions can be rather depressing. People just sit around and say how difficult life is. We really had some good suggestions. And I think the top one was really that a lot of African countries are doing pretty well now. And we made the point, that somebody said that their salaries in Nigeria have really gone up quite a bit recently. For Alistair and myself, our salaries are going down. They've gone down about 10% in the last few years. So that the Africans, countries, not all, that are doing well, really do have to make a bigger contribution to this. And I think that was a very strong feeling coming from people there. And how do you do that? Well, then it is a question of advocacy and how to do that. And I think those sort of grants that the Trust is doing, of teaching people how to communicate better and so on, I think that could be really important. There was a feeling that some of the money that is going into university is not being spent as well as it might be, or as openly and clearly, that if there is money coming from the government sources, one wants to see that coming in a fair, open way and not with political ties or other problems attached to it. And hopefully that money is going to create new positions, it's going to create a career pathway for people. It's no use if you've just got one job and there's no way you can move on because there's no position for that. And we did have this discussion that people felt pretty strongly that there does have to be a concentration of some expertise in some areas. You do have to have your centres of excellence, but we perhaps don't call them centres, because as we said this morning, everybody's in favour of that, as long as it's their centre that's the one that's chosen. And there has to be a way of sort of linking that to the other groups and supporting them. And I think another point that did come up as well, that was a very strong one, that it's no use just sort of saying, well, because I didn't have absolutely the most high-tech equipment that I use for my PhD, then I can't do something useful. People have to be a little bit more flexible and apply the knowledge and the skills, but perhaps not the particular expertise into those things. So I think we did have some good suggestions there for how this might be taken further, the next step. And I wanted to end on a positive note. I was responsible for the first MIM meeting for the UK. I was the representative for that. So it was the one from the United States, one from Europe, and one from the UK. And we really looked to see what we could do when we had the meeting in Dakar. We could not find 50 African scientists who were working on malaria. It was difficult enough in Europe and the United States. And I don't know how many we're going to have here this time, but it's going to be in the hundreds and probably, if not in over the thousands. So there has been a lot of progress in that, but there's still a long way to go. We haven't finished the thing, and we really need to see how we're going to help strong African groups in malaria to develop and prosper. So thank you. I think that's my last slide.
Well, I have one of these odd duties, a vote of thanks to prepare, and I think it was partly Francis's retribution for us putting him in the frame when we were in Germany to organise this workshop. But I think you don't always see all the work that goes on behind the scenes, and Francis has been working frantically because the time frame was extremely short. So I think he's done an excellent job in bringing all these people together, and I think the discussants and the audience this morning actually filled 2 hours very easily. We could have gone on for another hour. And I think Brian was right. We came up with, well, no, when I say we, the community came up with some really good ideas, and it wasn't just a whinging session. So I think that also worked very well. I think we've heard some interesting speakers this afternoon. So Lynn Marie, Jane, Kate and Brian, I think, have put forward some very good ideas. You've sort of seen Brian and Francis very much here, and you can see the work that they've done. The two people who you haven't seen who really committed to this idea are Jill Murray and Andy Waters, who essentially run EVIMalaR, and they put their money where our mouths are to bring this workshop together, which isn't really the mainstream for what EVIMalaR does, but I think it's part of their commitment to see the broader picture of malaria research and making it more relevant and more embedded within the countries where this disease is important. So without further ado, I think we should thank all of those people for their efforts.